Welcome to day 2 of Sound Faith 2025. For those of you who were here yesterday, what did you think of the debate? Is that good? Excellent. We hope to do more like that. Next year, this conference will be in Denver, Colorado, so go ahead and book your tickets. We appreciate you being here again today. This is going to be a fascinating discussion, just an informal conversation between two of the leading experts in the world on Jesus' resurrection. Let me go ahead and introduce them. To my right, I have Dr. Mike Licona, who is the professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University. He's the president of Risen Jesus, Inc. He has a PhD in New Testament studies with distinction from the University of Pretoria. Mike has participated in several high-profile debates with the likes of Shabir Ali, Richard Carrier, Matt Dillahunty, Dan Barker, and John Dominic Crossan. He's also had approximately 4 million debates with Dr. Bart Ehrman, the most recent of which, as you know, was right here last night. I also hear that Mike is proficient in firearms, so he can both teach you about Jesus and help you meet him. And to my left, we have the esteemed Dr. Dale Allison. He is the Richard J. Dearborn Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. He has a PhD from Duke University. He's the author of an uncountable number of books and journal articles. And one of the very interesting things that I discovered was that Dale published a book in 2006 called The Love There That's Sleeping, which is a sort of spiritual biography of the late Beatles member, George Harrison. So check that out. All right, we're going to dive in. I'm going to ask each of them some questions, and this whole conversation is about the question, can history prove the resurrection? And what better way to dig into that topic than by asking some esteemed world-class historians on the resurrection these questions. So, first question. Both of you are New Testament historians and experts on the resurrection. Mike, your book, The Resurrection of Jesus, was required reading for us at the master's degree in apologetics at Biola University. And Dale, your book, also called The Resurrection of Jesus, was recently called by Dr. William Lane Craig, quote, the most important book on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, end quote. I'm sorry, Mike, it wasn't your book, it was Dale's. So just real quick, what led each of you to be interested in exploring and researching the topic of Jesus' resurrection? And Mike, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, I would say it occurred in stages for me. So the very first one was in the fall of 1985. I was finishing up a master's degree in New Testament studies, and all my focus was on learning Greek so that I could read the New Testament in its original language, and was loving it so much. And I just, one day, for some reason, I woke up and I just started asking, how do I know this stuff is true? At that point, I had a pretty robust prayer life. I was praying maybe an hour to 2 hours a day. I was exegeting the Greek New Testament for hours every day. I was loving my work, but I just thought, do I believe because this is the way I was brought up? And what if I'd been brought up in Afghanistan? Would I be a Muslim in China, an atheist, etc.? And, before I devote my life to living for Christ, I want to make sure this is really true. And so I started to have doubts, and I got referred to Gary Habermas. And so I had a talk with him, and maybe 20 minutes later, I walked out feeling pretty good. I was just looking for reassurance of what I already believed. Well, then after I left school, just getting out in the real world, I started to talk to some non-believers and got some doubts, and I ended up calling Gary, and we had no email back then. And so we had a lot of talks, and he kept pointing me to the resurrection of Jesus. And it's like, yeah, you're right. If Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity's true, period. And like, wow, that made sense. So then I got into a PhD program, and I thought, you know what? Gary and I just finished writing this book, co-authoring The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And he was, at that point, still working on what would become his magnum opus. And I think he had 2,200 scholars at that point, or 2,200 academic writings on the resurrection that he had consulted And he was talking about percentages of scholars who believe this or whatever. And I said, well, who are these scholars? Well, they're primarily New Testament scholars. Okay. Well, how many of them have been trained in history, how to do historical work? Well, I don't know. So I thought, I wonder if you applied, how do historians, general historians outside the community of biblical scholars actually carry on their work? And so I decided to and see what it could yield. Now, my objective, I'll wrap this up. My objective was to develop a new argument for apologetic purposes. But a year into it, I'm reading Philosophy of History, Historical Method, and they're saying there's no such thing as an unbiased historian, and our biases and our objectives are the greatest threat to the integrity of our investigation. I thought, well, that's me. That's me. And so I worked really, really hard. I was determined that I wanted to do as an objective investigation as I could, because I'm a perpetual doubter. It's just one of my idiosyncrasies. And so it was for me as well to work on my doubts. Plus, I just wanted to have this investigation that I could say, I did this with integrity. I did not do it to confirm what I already believed. It was honestly to get to the truth. And I could live with it if the resurrection could not be, like if it said indeterminate. It doesn't lean one way or the other. I couldn't live with it if it pointed away. And so, after doing it, like a 6-year investigation, I came to the conclusion that I really do think that the evidence points to the resurrection of Jesus. So that's what got me involved. It was multiple steps along the way.
So my experience goes back a little before Mike's. So you mentioned 1985. My date is 1975, and I was in college. And at that point, I was exploring modern theology. So I was looking at Rudolf Bultmann, and I was reading Karl Barth, and I was paying attention as best I could to Paul Tillich and the Niebers and all these famous people. And then I finally found somebody that I liked, because I didn't really like any of those people. And this was a German theologian named Wolfhart Pannenberg. And I thought he was the brightest and most creative of all the theologians that I had run across in the 20th century. And at some point, I was reading his Christology, his book called Jesus, God, and Man. And in the middle of it, there are these pages where he sets up on historical grounds that Jesus rose from the dead. And it's a very interesting argument, which begins not with evangelical ideas about the accuracy of Scripture, but tries to construct an argument based on what he thought of as settled German New Testament criticism in the middle of the 20th century. So I remember reading these pages, I remember this vividly, and then finishing this section where he shows that Jesus rose from the dead. And I think this is correct. I think I stood up and paced, and I asked myself, what did he just do? Did he really just do this? In which case, this is absolutely astounding, right? This is one of the most important things I've ever read. Or did he not do this? I felt that he hadn't done it, but I didn't know why. I didn't know why I was not quite convinced. So that's actually where this begins with me. Then years later, when I wrote my first book, I wrote this little appendix on the resurrection. Nobody's ever read it. I've never seen any reference long. And then 20 years after that, I thought, gosh, I'd like to take those ideas and develop them. So I turned them into a very long essay in a book. And then after that book came out, I had some complaints. Mike complained about some things, as I recall. Bill Craig complained about things. Anyway, I had lots of responses, and I wasn't happy with how I'd done things, and I thought I needed to think about the criticism. So that's what led finally to the recent book. But it all goes back to wrestling with Professor Pannenberg and trying to figure out what the heck had he done in these pages.
Yeah, speaking of the books, I forgot to show you what these look like. And, you know, just giving you a little taste of what the evidence for the resurrection looks like. I mean, that's Dr. Lacona's, and this is Dr. Allison's. I mean, it is a lot of research that goes into these. I'm going to get autographs, by the way, after this. Great. Well, so Mike, in your book, one of the things that I really, really love about your book, in chapter 1, you have a section called Horizons. And it's all about how our past experiences and beliefs and our biases can really color the way we come to research and view really the whole world. And so you go through your journey of how you kind of address that before getting into your research on the resurrection. I was just wondering for both of you, you know, did you seek to address those horizons? What horizons did you bring to the table? And how did you seek to sort of mitigate those in your research?
So yeah, that's a good question, Tyson. That's the one thing that, as I was reading philosophers of history in general, practicing historians, they said our horizons are the greatest threat to the integrity of our investigation. So, you know, they talk about various ways to working to bracket your desired outcome while your investigation proceeds. So I picked from those the ones that I thought were the most important. And I had 6, but let me just give you the top 3. One would be method. So it's like, you know, if you wanted to write a book on something, you said, well, what do you want to write on and how are you going to do it? Well, I don't know. I'm just going to start and let's just see how it goes. You'd never do something like that, or you might, but it's not going to turn out well. And so I wanted to have method, and it's like Peter Novick in his 1980 book, That Noble Dream, he said, by the time the 1980s now had arrived, the practice of history was much like it's described in the book of Judges. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so I was looking for method, and it's like, all right, I want to come up with a method, a reasonable method here, and I want to make it public in my research so people see how I'm doing this and how I'm arriving at my conclusions, and they can critique my method. It's nothing done in secret, nothing underhanded here. Second, a concerted effort to do a detachment from my biases. Now, everyone is biased. A lot of people don't recognize it, or they think the other guy's biased. They don't recognize their own bias. I recognized I was biased, and it's like, all right, I got to somehow detach myself from it. Now, you never do 100%. But you work really hard at it. And so I worked really hard at it, and it was like, okay, I don't have to worry about truth. Truth is truth, and the truth about God, even if it turns out different than what I've believed all along or what I hope, I don't have to fear that. What I have to fear is that my biases will get in the way and keep me from discovering and following truth, and it cost me eternity. And that's the thing that kept me up at night. So it was in my best interest to detach myself from my bias and my desired outcome. And I found along the way that if I didn't I could get to a point where I believed I was really neutral. But I discovered that unless I made a concerted, deliberate effort to stay there, I would go back to my default position. And so I'd start reading things by like John Dominic Crossan or another skeptic. And I found myself, I'd read someone that agreed with me carefully, but I'd read someone who didn't agree with me. I just kind of skim it quickly. And then I said, no, I can't do that. I have to consider that every bit as seriously as those I agree with. So I'd have to start over with that. So detachment from bias. And then the third one was submitting to unsympathetic experts. And you do that through peer review, journal articles, things like that. One thing I just wanted to do, though, is I wanted to get involved in debate and take on skeptics, because I wanted to put my arguments out there that I was developing and see how someone like Ehrman, or someone who had, they didn't have the same blind spots I had. They had different blind spots, but they would really try to find problems with mine. And it's like, okay, if there's problems with it, let's find it. Let's find them. And so submitting it to unsympathetic experts, I found that debate really helped expose weaknesses in my method, my what I was doing, and helped me fine tune. And so that's kind of what I did to manage my bias, deal with horizons.
My story is a bit different. So the way when I was writing this last book, I remember sitting on the couch thinking about my biases and prejudices, and I realized that I was not of a single mind on several issues, and I was not of two minds, but on many issues, I was of four minds. And I concluded that I am a sort of multiple, and that I have four different people inside of me. Now, one of those is a pious Christian. I get up every morning, I have my routine, I say my prayers, and so on. That person goes to church. That person teaches at a Presbyterian seminary and tries to help future pastors learn the ropes. I also within me have a critical historian who has doubts about how hard it is to establish historical conclusions. This person has studied all sorts of historical episodes and knows that for all of them, there are multiple takes on them. Even recent events, if you read one book on JFK's assassination, you might be convinced. And the problem is, if you read a second book, you might think, well, that's a pretty good theory too. The problem is, after you read 8 of them and decide they're all good, you realize how hard history really can be. So I have this stubborn historian in here who's always wondering about the Christian claims made by this guy who wants to be a Christian. The third person is just a skeptic, an all-out skeptic. I went through public school, through college, and received a secular education. I was taught to think about the whole world without reference to God. There was no God in high school, college. There was no God in biology. There was no God in philosophy. All my philosophy professors wanted to get God out of me. They were mortified when I said, I'm going to do a PhD in biblical studies, not philosophy, right? They thought I was throwing my life away. But my religion professors also tried to stamp religion out of me, but they often had really good arguments. And when I was reading Hume, I thought, is Hume right about that? Or when I'm reading, this old German philosopher, is he right about this? So there's this doubter in there too. And then the fourth person is the weirdo who just thinks the parapsychologists are right about everything and the world is truly weird and baffling and mysterious and weird things happen all the time. And if Jesus rose from the dead, maybe that's just one more weird thing. So I have these four people in me and they have very different points of view. I think I'm lucky because there's no integrating personality. They all get along. So they talk to each other all the time, right? And, at some point when I'm writing, I have to say, okay, I have to have a voice each other. So that's how I address the issue of horizons.
Mike, do you have a weirdo in you too?
Don't we all?
He's not as weird as I am, but he is open-minded, I have learned.
Mike, you mentioned methodology as one of the biases. And what's interesting is you both look at the same evidence and often, or sometimes, come to different conclusions. And I wonder, are you using the same methodology? And also, since you know each other's work, can you briefly describe your individual approaches and methodology to examining the resurrection?
Yes. So my approach that I learned as I'm reading philosophers of history and general historians, the first thing you do is you identify your best sources. So, for example, from the 18th century, the hymn by John Wesley and his brother, "Christ the Lord is risen today." You would never use that as evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, right? You want something that is very close to the alleged event. And preferably, if you can get it by eyewitnesses or those who knew them, or, the closer to the event, the closer to the eyewitnesses, the better. So you look at the best sources. So when I'm doing this, I look, of course, the first thing that comes up would be the Gospels. Well, at that point, I hadn't studied things about the reliability of the Gospels as much as I have now, and I knew that there's a lot. I mean, there's things that I could give, reason. Okay, you can believe the Gospels because of this, but maybe this is problematic, and what about contradictions and things like that? And so, well, there's really no agreement among critical scholars, and I'm trying to manage my own bias and make sure I don't accept something too quickly. If anything, I want to go in the opposite direction and be overcautious. So in my doctoral work, I bracketed the Gospels, and I didn't even use them. I just said, there's no consensus on this, so I'm not going to use them. Maybe my bias would tend to make me think they are reliable to some extent, at least, but I'm not going to use them in that sense. So I look at Paul's letters. Okay, well, these are some of our earliest stuff, and Paul has connection with the alleged eyewitnesses. Some of the apostles like Peter, James, and John. And so, yeah, that's going to be pretty good. And you've got these oral traditions that go way back. All right. So that's very early. So, yeah, that's real good. Well, what about the apostolic fathers? Well, which ones would have the greatest promise? Maybe Clement of Rome, especially Polycarp. What about Ignatius? Well, we don't really have any reports that he's connected directly to the apostles. So what do we do with Clement and Polycarp? Well, possible plus. I don't rate them nearly as high as Paul, but they might give us something. What about the Gnostic and non-canonical Christian literature? Maybe something in the Gospel of Thomas, probably not in the other side. What about non-Christian sources like Josephus or Tacitus? Well, Tacitus, Josephus with the death, maybe a little bit more with Josephus, maybe not. So I'm looking at the what are our best sources? And then you go through those sources. What are some things, if I comb through them, that I can learn with a pretty good degree of confidence? Things we might call facts. And data, facts that are so strongly supported by the data that they are granted as facts by a vast majority of scholars on every part of the theological spectrum, whether conservative, moderate, progressive, agnostic, atheist, things like that. And if agnostic atheists are accepting them as well, then I know it's not just my biases that are causing me to accept it. So then I take those facts and I formulate hypotheses. And you compare the hypotheses by specific criteria of arguments of inference to the best explanation: explanatory scope, explanatory power, less ad hoc plausibility, perhaps even illumination, things like this. And the hypothesis that best explains the facts is regarded as what probably occurred. So that's my method.
So I think I have at least two methods in my book. Now, the first method would cover the first large portion of the book, and I don't think there's anything special or interesting about it. I think probably everything I do there would fall into what Mike just said. So this is where I discuss who buried Jesus. Is the story about Joseph of Arimathea plausibly historical? Was the tomb plausibly found empty? And so on. So when I'm Doing some things, I'm just being a conventional historian and following typical methods. So there's nothing interesting there, even though my conclusions tend to be conservative, which I think is interesting. In fact, within my context, I once referred to my conclusions as antediluvian, because my context is the liberal wing of the Society of Biblical Literature. But more interesting to me is my method in the second part of the book, which is called Thinking with Parallels. And there I'm doing comparative work that absolutely well, there are a couple of exceptions, but most people don't like it. So if, let's say, the sources say that people thought they saw Jesus soon after he died, one of my questions is, are there other people in other times and places who think that they have seen or encountered somebody who just died? So I have a whole chapter on that, asking, does this illumine anything? Maybe it doesn't, but it's worth looking at. I have a whole chapter on Marian apparitions, because these are collective events in which people claim to see the same thing. What do we do with them? What do we make of them? We'll talk about this in a few minutes. I have a chapter on this weird Tibetan belief that some people shrink away in a few days and communicate with their disciples afterwards. I also have a whole chapter on appearances of Jesus through the centuries, because there are people today, I've talked to two of them, who have, they believe, seen Jesus. So this is where the weird person enjoys what's going on the most. But I want to compare weird and strange with weird and strange. Maybe not like with like, but like with almost like. Now, the problem with this is that many apologists are sort of allergic to this, because if the resurrection of Jesus is unique, their inclination is just to deny that there are any kind of parallels to anything. And then the skeptics don't like this, because I am not a closed mind reductionist. When I talk about these other things, I make it clear that I think some of these things are probably veridical or real, or that they really happen. So this puts me in what we used to call no man's land. I don't know what that's called now, since we can't say man, but you know, the place on the battlefield in the middle where you don't want to be because everybody's shooting at you. So nobody's agreeing with me on that. So there, I think I'm being my most creative, and I think I'm being my most interesting. But there, I'm not doing traditional historical work, the sort of thing that I do in the first part, and that Mike is doing much of the time. I'm just trying to set things side by side and say, are there any real similarities? Are the similarities bogus? Does this tell us anything if there are some similarities? Similarities, of course, always come with differences. So you can always just object to what I'm doing and saying, well, look at the differences. But that doesn't work for me, because there are always differences when you compare related things. You can't compare related things unless if they're identical, right? So that second method makes me a little odd, I suppose.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I still want to get your idea on this, but just in a brief, maybe one or two words. Mike, what do you think is a strength and a weakness of Dale's method? And Dale, same thing for you about Mike's method.
I don't know if I can do one or two words. I'll make it as brief as I can. I've learned a lot from Dale and reading his work, and it's been very inspirational to me over the years during my doctoral work and subsequent. He's extremely authentic and honest, and he's just a premier and elite scholar in the way he cares some, but there are a few scholars that I respect as much as there are none that I respect more. That said, I would say the weakness, I would cite two. One would be, I think, his burden of proof too high. It's above what general historians would require. And the second would be, I'd say he doesn't have a specific method for comparing hypotheses to say, you know, when something is probable as the final result. And that became, I had suspected that, but that became apparent to me yesterday during our panel discussion when a physician at the end asked, and he said he wasn't aware of any. And it's like, well, you know, just look in some history primers, and, you know, there's some in there that talk about how to judge between hypotheses and get at probability. But that's not to say anything to undermine his work. I love the stuff he does.
Well, we're not having a debate tonight, so I will ignore those last comments. Having said that, I think the minimal approach, minimal facts approach is the best thing out there. It's the closest argument to being persuasive. Mike and I disagree because I think if you are a skeptic, there is a skeptical scenario that you can believe in without feeling too nervous. But I do actually agree with Mike. If you look at in Mike's book, the one 2000, what is it? 2010. I think Mike's right about all of the skeptical scenarios. I think they're mostly pretty bad, and most of them aren't taken seriously. So as devil's advocate, I tried to develop a better skeptical scenario because I have a skeptic within me. I think I came up with a better skeptical scenario than anything Mike tackles. And I wasn't convinced yesterday that anybody had dismantled that. So I think that's a lot. I think the argument's better than Pannenberg's. I think it's better than, yeah, it's better. It's the best of the apologetical arguments I know.
What would you say our weakness is? I'd be curious to know.
Oh, I don't think you've excluded the skeptical, or can exclude the skeptical hypothesis that I put forward in the book.
Okay.
Great. Well, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the resurrection itself. Obviously, one of the strongest parts of the resurrection argument, one of the things that we really lean on are the appearances after Jesus' death and burial. And there does appear to be some confusion about the appearances in the Gospels. For instance, Matthew 28:17 says, some worshiped, but others doubted. And then you get to Luke, and you have the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and they didn't immediately recognize Jesus. And then you get to John 20. Mary Magdalene herself did not immediately recognize Jesus, thought he was a gardener, right? So how do we explain this confusion in light of Jesus' resurrection?
Well, the way I would do it, the Emmaus disciples, that's an interesting one. But the text does says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. I don't know what to do with that. Why would they have been kept from recognizing? Well, the text doesn't tell us. You know, did Jesus want to play with them for a while and see what would happen? You know, it is kind of funny, you know. Why the long faces, guys? Were you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't know what happened here? No, what? You know, it's like it's playing with them. It's kind of funny. The Mary Magdalene at the tomb, why doesn't she recognize Jesus? Well, I've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre twice, once with Eric. Yeah, we went together, didn't we? Different Eric, sorry. So anyway, we were over in, a bunch of us were over there in Israel, and we went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and there's all these tombs around it, ancient tombs. And so you step down into one, and it was interesting. I stepped down into it, and then I turn around to look at my colleagues, and I could see them only up to their waist. So it's like if Mary's inside the tomb and she turns around and looks, she said, "Why are you weeping?" And she turns around and looks, she's only going to see him up to his waist. So maybe that's why she thought he was a gardener at first. I don't know. The Matthew 28:17, I think that one is pretty easy to look at. So it says they worshiped him, but some doubted. Now, I'm persuaded that is the same That's the same appearance as we find in Luke 24. The difference, of course, in Luke 24, it's in Jerusalem. In Matthew 28, it's in Galilee. And I think one of them has displaced it to a different location. I don't know which one, but I'm convinced it's the same one. In my book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I give numerous reasons why. And I do think that Luke has conflated two group appearances there. But what's really interesting is he uses a different term than Matthew does. Matthew uses dystazo, which means for doubt. We use the word doubt, but it means to think two things. It's used on one other occasion in Matthew. That's where Peter walks on water and he sees the wind and the waves, and he begins to sink. And Jesus rescues him and says, "Why did you doubt?" He's thinking two things. It's like he's got enough faith to walk on the water, but then he's thinking, well, how am I doing this? And if I sink, I'm in trouble here. Luke uses a stronger term, apistos, unbelief. But notice what he says. Out of joy and wonder, they were unbelieving. What? Out of joy and wonder, they were unbelieving. There's only one way to understand that, and that is to say that it's like Game 7 of the World Series, bottom of the ninth, walk-off home run. Unbelievable! You know, it's not like they've got their arms crossed and lips pursed and they're wagging their heads. That's not what it meant by unbelief. And that's a stronger term than what Matthew uses for doubt. So I think that some of them are worship and others are thinking, man, wow, but how? I think that's what's going on.
So this is I think, a fun question as well as an important question. To my knowledge, the first source to address this is actually the so-called pseudo-Mark. That is, in your old King James Bible, you had Mark 16:9 and following. And in the modern Bibles, they stop at 16:8, and they typically say this was added later. So it's probably a 2nd century edition, and it tries to explain the Emmaus Road, and it says that he appeared in a different form. Really interesting. Somehow he was in a different form, and that's supposed to explain it. Origen said, well, he was in a transitional state between physicality and his new spiritual body. So he was just in a very strange, weird shape or condition or form. Augustine said God blinded these people so that they wouldn't see, as some kind of psychological drama going on. And it gets stranger with the later Protestants. So there is one, I remember running across one 19th century Protestant who said, well, Jesus obviously had new clothes, had a new outfit. And that's why they didn't recognize him, because, new duds there. I also ran across some people who said, at least with regard to Mary, she must have been crying. And when you cry, your eyes are blurry and therefore you can't see. I remember running across one commentator who said, well, on the Emmaus Road, it must have been that Jesus was walking in front of them and they were kind of off to the side behind him, to the left and right, and so they couldn't see his face and so on. So you get all these rationalistic explanations. My guess is that these are really strange experiences. And this is part of what's going on. I don't have an explanation except to say, I don't think this is just ordinary encounter with Jesus exactly as he was before. But the tradition does struggle with this and comes up with all sorts of sometimes stupid explanations for it.
Great. So Matthew 27, 52 to 53. We're getting into some of the things that are brought up in these discussions, but not necessarily super related to the resurrection. So this is the episode where many dead saints were raised and they kind of walked the streets at Jesus' death. Mike, you think these are special effects that were included in the text that didn't necessarily happen, but they do highlight the magnitude of the event. So they weren't meant to be understood in a historical sense. And Dale, you think Matthew reported on this because there was a story about it already circulating at the time, but the story itself is just a fiction. It's just a tall tale or some type of folklore that was already in circulation. Right. So why do each of you kind of reach that conclusion from the text?
Well, when I was doing my doctoral work, I think it was John Dominic Crossan who said something like, that text is the clearest example of myth making in the Bible, or something like that. And I thought, okay, let's take a look at this. A lot of commentaries don't even want to touch on it. And then I remember reading Raymond Brown, and he cited a number of Greco-Roman sources that talk about these portents. So, for example, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, you had a number of Greco-Roman authors who mentioned it, and then portents that occurred, like an eclipse of the sun, a comet, things like that. Virgil, who is a poet, I think he gave 13 different portents. So he said things like, black intestines were seen outside of cattle. Streams stopped flowing. Fighting was seen in the heavens. Pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. So yeah, I had these kind of, there was a darkness. Mount Etna erupted. There was a comet. Kind of interesting. And then later on, I believe it's Cassius Dio, and he mentions that when Nero at one point, during his wicked reign, that there was a comet, there was an eclipse of the sun, the doors to the temple of Jupiter that took 20 men to opened by themselves. Let's see, did I say a comet, an eclipse of the sun, that there were voices heard in the forest, that there was a giant woman with snakes as her hair, and she walked around the city and terrified people. When Josephus reports about the temple in Jerusalem being, just before it was destroyed, he said there was an eclipse of the sun, there was a comet, a light shone down on the temple in the middle of the night, and it was brighter than midday. Fighting was seen in the heavens. The doors to the temple, which took many men to opened by themselves. A cow gave birth to a lamb. And it's okay, all right, we see where these guys are going with this. And then I have a friend named John Ramsey. He's now retired. He's emeritus professor of Greek classics at the University of Chicago in Illinois. And in 2006, I believe it was, he published a catalog of Greco-Roman comets from 500 BC to 400 AD. And so he catalogs every one of them and gives the original text, the translation, and in some cases, you can see that in addition to the comet, there are other things reported, like an eclipse of the sun. Well, in some cases, we can confirm that the comet actually was there, because you find it in either the Chinese or the Korean literature, which would not have been, it wouldn't have been related to the Greco-Roman stuff. Or we know it was something like the Hale-Bopp comet or Halley's comet that would have shown up at that time. But what's really interesting is NASA has a website, and you can go there and you can enter a region and enter a year, and it will tell you if an eclipse of the sun was visible in that region that year. And there's like 2 occasions where you can do this, and you can know the comet was there, but the eclipse is fictional, which tells us that the Greco-Roman authors sometimes would amplify these events by adding a portent that wasn't there. And they do these things even today. So I have a friend who's a retired pathologist, and I'm not going to mention this person's name or gender, but this person shares the gospel with Muslims, and went to a New Year's celebration, a Persian New Year's celebration in 2022. And she told me that during that, they paused for a moment, and the MC said, let's look back 2 years. 2 years ago, this certain singer, I forgot the name, but was killed in a car accident. And when that happened, the sun went dark and stars fell out of the sky. Like they're still doing this today in Middle Eastern culture. So I think that stuff is similar to us today saying something like 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. It's not meant to be understood. If 1,000 years from now someone said, wow, that must have been amazing when those two twin towers went down, it caused that much the earth to shake. I mean, yeah, that must just be myth making. No, it's not meant to be understood in that sense. And I don't want to keep going with this, but if you want to interpret those as historical, that they were raised, you run into theological problems actually, as well as historical problems. So my opinion is the best explanation for what these raised saints are is that Matthew added these to highlight, to amplify that the Son of God had just died.
I'll preface my comments by saying that we're not going to get anywhere. We do disagree on this one completely. So a couple of things. One is I don't see any markers in Matthew's text that sets this off. In fact, when I read Matthew, his and then, it seems to me this is part of a sequence that has to do with the crucifixion, the darkness, the torn veil, and the burial. And it's just part of the historical sequence, and there's nothing that sets it off and tells me, hey, this is different. So that would be my first claim anyway. My second observation is that there is, to my knowledge, and I have done work on this, there's not a single Christian before the 19th century who thought this is fiction or that it is decoration or that it's theological symbolism without a historical event behind it. That includes the allegorizers, such as Origen, who are wont from time to time to say, well, this didn't happen, but it's there because it tells us a lesson. He thinks this happened. In fact, the entire early church thought this happened because this text, beginning in the 2nd century, maybe even before, is tied up with the descent into hell, which everybody took literally. Who are these saints? Well, they're the ones that Jesus rescued when he went to Hades, and he brought them up after 3 days. That's how everybody in the early church sees this. The church fathers also, none of them take this allegorically or non-literally, and they know Plutarch. They've had classical education. They know this literature way better than we do. It was their curriculum, and they're not thinking like this. Calvin knows this literature also. He has a Renaissance education, and he refers to other events happening, weird supernatural events happening with other figures in antiquity, but he still thinks it happened. So I'm also inclined to think that while you might be able to falsify this claim to an eclipse or to a comet, that by and large, they thought these things happened. I think what happened is that when some major event took place, people looked around and tried to find strange things so they could correlate them with what is going on. And there are enough eclipses and there are enough earthquakes and there are enough weird things that happen that people can put them into their accounts. So we have a disagreement here on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay. I want to make sure we get to Q&A time, so I'm going to kind of skip some of the other questions that I had listed, but I do want to get to this issue with your work specifically, Dale, because you have a very, very interesting excursus on something called Tibetan rainbow bodies, which to our ears in the West here would be like just completely bizarre. So what in the world are Tibetan rainbow bodies, and what do they have to do with the resurrection of Jesus?
I don't know what they have to do with the resurrection of Jesus, but I think they're fascinating. So this is a claim that's actually ongoing, but it has a long history. And the gist of it is that you have a Tibetan holy man. There are some women, but they're mostly men. Some Tibetan adept who is a Buddhist, and this person dies. And then supposedly, this person then will begin to shrink or disappear over the period of several days. Sometimes these people just shrink halfway. And weirdly enough, I don't know what to make of them. There are some pictures on the internet of these half-shrunk people. Occasionally, the claim is, well, there was some hair and fingernails and toenails left, but everything else is gone. And then there's a rainbow, supposedly, that accompanies this. And then also, interestingly enough, people will claim, disciples will claim that they got communications from this person shortly afterwards. Now, I say clearly in the book that I actually have no idea what's going on here. I am a bit skeptical. I have a skeptical part within me, but I have talked to people who have been over there. I've talked to Father Tiso, who went over there maybe the year 2000, a couple of years after one of these events occurred. This is supposedly it's an ongoing thing, and went to the village where this supposedly happened and interviewed people who were there, and there was no body, supposedly. And the people, told their story and so on. And he thinks, well, maybe it really happened. I don't know. So, Christians are always asking atheists and skeptics to be open-minded, right? So I want to be open-minded. So I just say up front, I don't know. I've not been to Tibet. I'm not involved, but I have talked to at least 3 people who have been involved in Tibetans and have been to Tibet and tell me, no, I've said, am I going to be stupid for even thinking about this? And they say, no, there's something probably weird going on. You should write about this, Dale. But in the book, here's one thing I do say, and it was missed yesterday. But it seems to me that we do have claims to a missing body, or we have claims to missing bodies, and then claims that the adept who has disappeared, or mostly disappeared, then appeared later. If all of these are fiction, it shows how, at least in one culture and one time, you can come up with stories about missing bodies that everybody believes. The Dalai Lama believes this stuff. He doesn't think it's symbolism. He thinks it really happens. He thinks it really, and I've talked to people who've been to Tibet. Yeah, they think it happens. They're not saying it's an earth-shaking event. So I don't have any idea what's going on. It seems to me, if there is something going on in some of these cases, wouldn't that be interesting? If nothing is going on and this is all fiction, well, it shows how easy, at least in that time and place, it is to create these stories that, at least in some vague sense, resemble some Christian claims. So I think we need to look into it. And that's all I'm saying. I honest to God, I have no opinion about this. I just think this is a phenomenon. People in the West haven't looked at it. Tells us how easy it is to create stories of missing, or it tells us, whoa, I don't know what.
Mike, are you open-minded like Dale? Are you open to Tibetan rainbow bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go with where the evidence is. And I remember reading them for the first time in Dale's book. I thought, this is strange. I don't know what to do with them. I haven't really investigated them myself, so I don't know what to do with them. It really does seem to be a strange phenomenon. What can we say about them? I don't know. They say there are eyewitnesses of these, like Dale has said. How does that compare with what we have for resurrection? I don't know. I haven't talked to those alleged eyewitnesses. Of course, we didn't talk with the disciples either, right? What we do know we have with the disciples is we know that they were willing to suffer continuously. We don't know that all of them did die as a martyr, but it does seem that we can have a fair degree of confidence they were willing to die for their gospel proclamation, which would strongly suggest they believed what they were preaching, that Jesus had appeared to them. I think we have good enough evidence that whatever the nature of these appearances were, they occurred to individuals and to groups. And we also have a non-believer who was persecuting the church, who did a 180 and became one of Christianity's greatest advocates because he believed the risen Jesus appeared to him. So do we have that happening with an enemy of the rainbow bodies? Are there group appearances? I don't know. If it did, it would be some interesting phenomena. But I mean, this is what we have for resurrection. I just haven't studied the rainbow bodies. Really haven't studied it other than reading it in Dale's book. But I don't think I could discount it. I wouldn't discount it just, because it doesn't fit comfortably in my worldview. There are weird things that happen in this world, and I don't anticipate that the Bible tells us everything about reality. So I am open.
Okay. I titled this talk, Can History Prove the Resurrection? And having read both of your works, I know pretty confidently that both of you would answer that by saying, no, we can't prove that the resurrection occurred from history in the modern sense of the word prove. But both of you do, in some sense, affirm the resurrection of Jesus. So, why do you both affirm it as a real event? And how strong do you think that connection is between the historical evidence and the truth of the resurrection?
So when we say prove, it'd be like you're getting into a time machine and going to the past and seeing it, okay? Prove with a mathematical certainty. That's what I'm saying. No, you can't prove anything historically in that sense. All we can talk about is probability when it comes to the past. So I think in terms, like I talked about my method a little bit earlier, and so many historians have what I would call a spectrum of historical confidence. And so right in the middle is indeterminate, the wrong direction. Like it's doubtful, it's very doubtful, it's certain that it did not happen. And then in the other direction, probable, very probable, it's certain that it happened. I don't think you ever get there. I would put it, and every historians, I've seen historians rated differently, general historians and biblical scholars, like James D.G. Dunn said, more probable than not. If it's more probable than not, so if it outdistances other competing hypotheses, and it's more probable than not, that's usually good enough. That wasn't good enough for me. I thought something between probable and very probable would satisfy me. And that's where I think the resurrection of Jesus lands, somewhere right in between probable and very probable.
So for me, a lot hinges upon the question of worldview. And if you are an atheist or a skeptic or a reductionistic materialist, the evidence is not going to convince you. I don't think the evidence is strong enough to overthrow a worldview if you are set in it. Now, we can then ask, should skeptics be skeptics and should materialists be materialists? But in my book, that's not the question I'm asking. I'm assuming that there are skeptics and there are atheists and there are people, some of them very smart and accomplished, who don't think that miracles can happen. So if you are addressing those people, I personally think they have to adopt a scenario that is improbable. You have to have several things happen to explain early Christian faith that aren't terribly probable. But from their point of view, the resurrection of a dead man is even more improbable. So I think it's relative to your worldview. If you're Richard Swinburne, it's easy because you can, on philosophical grounds, show there's likely a good God, and this God cares about human beings, and this God would want to incarnate. And if this God were killed, God would want to raise him from the dead, and God would want an atonement for sins, and so on. If you can do all this sort of without the New Testament, then the evidence for the resurrection fits just really nicely. It fits for me because I have a Christian worldview where I have problems, I guess, with some of my apologetical friends is that I don't think it can be a sort of foundational plank or epistemological plank on which you build everything else. For me, belief in the resurrection is part of a larger worldview, and it itself does not establish that worldview, but fits or does not fit within that worldview. It fits within mine. I am happy to say that I don't believe any of the skeptical hypotheses, and the one I put in my book, I deem to be improbable. But again, if I'm playing devil's advocate and speaking from the point of view of somebody who knows that miracles don't happen and that natural law governs everything, then that person is not irrational, given that presupposition, to think that, let's say, thieves stole the body and Mary Magdalene hallucinated and a couple of other things happened and that got the ball rolling. So I'm really big on things being relative to worldview. So even when you talk about the plausibility of things, you always have to ask, what are the presuppositions of the person for whom this is plausible or implausible?
You both have poured decades of yourselves into this research, time, energy, money. It's a lot. And there is no research of this sort that doesn't have some type of existential impact, especially on a topic this important. So how has your research on this topic impacted your personal life? And how has it done that?
Well, ultimately, for me, when I engaged in this back in my doctoral research, like I said, I started off with one objective for it, for apologetic purposes, but about a year into it, that changed entirely, and that was abandoned. And now it's like, no, I want to do this with the greatest amount of integrity in my investigation, and I want to find out for me. So it has helped me with my doubts. Because I know how much I wrestled with this to get to as close as possible to being as objective, neutral as possible when I was doing my research. My wife knows how much I wrestled with it. I mean, she'll tell you there was one night that I thought she was asleep, and I'm just laying in bed, and then she says through the darkness, "You're doubting again, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And so what do you believe now? I said, "Well, I still believe God exists." "You're not even sure if Jesus rose?" "Well, no, I'm not. I'm trying to be as objective as possible. And if I come out on a negative end on this, I'm going to have to quit my job and find something else to do." And it worried her, but it's like truth. It means everything to me. And so it has helped my doubts. And it really helps my conscience that way, because I can speak with honesty and say, I really looked at this as objectively as I could. Now, was I perfect? No. Did I make mistakes? Probably. I mean, I don't know where they are. I mean, Dale doesn't think he's made any mistakes. I don't either. But I do know that I have confidence. As much of doubter as I've been over the years, I know that I did this with the greatest amount of integrity that I could have. And that satisfies me. That helps me personally and allows me to to speak with honesty and transparency. And yeah, so it's really helped me.
So the first thing that comes to mind is just that I really am convinced more, having worked further, that none of the skeptical scenarios are obviously true, and that they all have high improbabilities as ingredients. But maybe more importantly, I'd like to think, I hope this is true, that my work on this has made me more humble. So when I started out this in the 1970s and 80s, I really thought, wow, I'm an historian. I'm going to be able to figure everything out. And when I do, everybody will listen to me, and that'll be it. And I realized at some point that historians can't do everything, and that I need philosophers, and that I need theologians to think with, and just being the historian isn't going to take us to the theological promised land. So I learned that my vocation was limited, and that was humbling. The other thing that I'd like to think is humbling is that I have, doing this research, run into things like rainbow bodies. So I didn't know anything about rainbow bodies until I was writing this book. And somebody said, hey, have you heard about this? I know. How do I find out about this? And I looked into it and I thought, that's weird. And then I looked at some Marian apparitions, and some of them puzzled me. And I came away thinking, that's weird. I spent more time working on apparitions of the dead, and my work has led me to think this is a really strange place, way stranger than I thought 20 years ago. And it's so strange that I need to be humble in my opinions about it. So maybe this has made me more humble.
Great.
If I may say so.
You're very humble. Before we get to the Q&A, let me just say that we're incredibly grateful for you both sharing your wealth of information, your years and years of knowledge being distilled down to this moment. So can we just give a round of applause for these guys? We're going to go ahead and open up for Q&A now. So there are two microphone stands, one on the left and one on my right, over here on the left, and one on the right. So on the right, we'll have questions for Dr. Allison. On the left, we'll have questions for Dr. Licona. So go ahead and come to the mics if you have a question. We'll go ahead and go for about 15 minutes. Yes, sir.
Hi. So Dr. Allison, great to hear you tonight. So I am studying the contemporary scientific and medical research into deathbed visions. So these are deathbed experiences. And I'm seeking to draw philosophical and theological conclusions from those studies. So my question for you is, how open do you think Christian academia is to the study of visionary experiences? And assuming the answer is not very, how do we overturn that situation?
So I think that situation may take care of itself, by which I mean there are more people in the medical field paying attention to these things. I don't know if you're familiar with the work that took place in a Buffalo hospice.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so some of those interviews are online. They're very touching. Somebody is, just a few days from death, and they're perfectly lucid, and they're not on medications, and they say, I am seeing my husband. And the interviewer says, are you hallucinating? And they say, no. Okay, so I think if we have enough stuff like that, the culture can change. I don't know that Christians are going to lead the charge, but at some point we will realize that if this is part of what does go on in the world, we need to figure out